One of the most memorable trips that Garrett and I have taken was our Christmas market cruise to Germany and Austria in December 2019. The warm spiced wine, scents of roasting nuts filling the air, and the enchantment of hand-carved wooden toys and ornaments were magical. Our visit at the end of the cruise to Salzburg, Austria, home to Mozart and Garrett's all-time favorite movie, The Sound of Music, was unforgettable. The day trip was not enough to scratch the surface of the city's many charms and attractions, and we agreed to visit again and spend more time in this enchanting city. I'll never forget the joy radiating from Garrett's face as he spoke of his desire to travel with our family so that our grandsons Milo and Ben could also experience the enchantment of Salzburg. Even in their young ages, Milo and Ben were already mesmerized by the soundtrack of their papa's favorite movie. 2020 began with so much joy and excitement. We started making travel plans for the year, and Garrett began spending more time with Milo and Ben, attending Milo's soccer practices, going to the beach, and showing them how to fish for golden tilapia in the aquaponics that he built in our backyard brought so much joy to Garrett. At the end of May 2020, however, our hopes, dreams, and joys started to fade away, and darkness came with a vengeance. Medical tests revealed that Garrett had life-threatening health conditions. Words are pathetically powerless to describe the devastation we felt, and impossible to express the anguish and shock that buried us. Garrett had been the epitome of good health. He ate well, exercised, loved working in our yard, and golfed 2 to 3 times a week. Even the COVID shutdown couldn't slow him down. He still went to his office every day to be present for clients who were financially affected by the stay-at-home orders. On June 12, 2020, Garrett suffered a major stroke and long-term prognosis was grim. With Garrett's unexpected and rapid health decline, I felt helpless and desperate for hope. The pain of seeing Garrett in his condition and the fear of him dying left me emotionally and spiritually exhausted and questioning God's love. Everything was unfolding in ways that seemed contrary to his love and inconsistent with whom I thought God was. During Garrett's stays at Queen's Hospital and Rehabilitation Hospital of the Pacific, we prayed together. I read scriptures and he recited Bible verses. I thought by reading God's words and delighting in God that somehow, some way, I could obtain the miracle that Garrett needed. After all, God's promise in Psalm 37 verse 4 is, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." I found myself face down, on my knees, pleading with God to give me the desire of my heart, which was for a miraculous healing for Garrett. But the miracle I was praying for never came. On July 16, 2020, at 3:23 a.m., Garrett took his last breath on earth and his first breath in heaven. My journey in the wilderness after Garrett's passing was profound. The grief and depression that followed was suffocating. Despite my best efforts at healthy grieving, I struggled, overwhelmed by sorrow, heartbreak, and loss. Walking in the wilderness is not the path I would have chosen. Not a day goes by that I don't think about Garrett, and I miss him dearly. But I remind myself that every day I am closer to heaven and seeing him again. This knowledge is profoundly comforting and motivates me to anchor my heart more steadfastly in God's love and faithfulness. As I look back now, although I wasn't emotionally or spiritually equipped during Garrett's sickness, I believe that's exactly what God intended. Not being prepared allowed me to desperately seek after God and not trust on my own strength and wisdom. God carried me and equipped me in Garrett's final weeks and days to pray with him, encourage him, and connect him closer to God. Garrett's relationship with God was rekindled, and his faith in God was solidified. I can say with certainty that Garrett is rejoicing in the Lord's presence and living a life in eternity. My prayer for miracles was answered, just not the way I had hoped it would be. Although Garrett was not healed on earth, he received full healing in heaven. My wilderness journey continues. I'm starting to resurrect and become alive again. I am witnessing the hand of God orchestrating peace and healing in all areas of my life. I find treasures that he places strategically in my daily walk, and God's graciousness abounds. One of the sweetest treasures was the birth of our first granddaughter, Madeline Marie Choi, on March 13th, 2021. She came 3 weeks early, but in God's perfect timing. She brings into our lives a new season, a new beginning. She is beautiful, and Papa Garrett is smiling down from heaven. As I continue my journey, there will be other wilderness that I walk through, but I know now the true meaning of Psalm 37 verse 4. As I delight myself in the Lord and make Him the true longing of my heart, He will carry me and give me true peace, joy, and fulfillment no matter my trials or circumstances.
I'm trying to tell Sherelle thank you quietly, but I guess the microphone is on. Thank you, Katie. Oh, what a beautiful song. Beautiful reminder this morning. So please, if you're not seated, make yourself as comfortable as you can underneath the rain. My notes are soggy. Who knows if I'll even be able to read them. I'll just ramble on. But it's good to be with you this morning. Christ is risen. Okay, let's try that. Christ is risen. He's risen indeed. And hopefully the sun will come out soon and we can get a little drier here. When I was a kid, I used to like to skip to the end of stories. If the tension was a little bit tight or I wasn't really sure what was going to happen, I would just flip to the back few pages to make sure it all ended okay. If you're watching, before we had DVDs, if you were watching on a VCR, it was kind of hard because like if you fast forwarded, you'd have to rewind again and you don't really know where to get back to where you were. So books are a little easier, right? You just kind of flip to the end and it's right there in front of you. And I was kind of cured of this when I was a new mom, and I picked up a book. It was the 7th in a series. And I hadn't read any of the books, but I had watched a few movies, and I figured, it'll be fine. And I opened the book, and I found out that one of the main characters died. And I was like, what? I was so mad and shocked, and that kind of cured me. It kind of ruined it for me. I didn't like skipping to the end anymore. But I don't think I'm the only one that has ever wanted to skip to the end of something. Like right now, I just kind of want to skip to the end of where it stops raining. Right? Sometimes when you're a student, you just want to skip to the end of the semester, maybe when you turn everything in or finish with your exams. Or maybe we could just skip to the end of when COVID is over. Or maybe when your student loans are paid off. Or maybe when you're married. Or maybe when your spouse is back from deployment. Or maybe when your kids are out of school. Or maybe you just want to skip to the end of your chemo treatment. Or when you retire. Or when you can fill in the blank. there are a lot of things we'd like to skip to the end of. I drove by a church a week ago on Palm Sunday. It's a church I used to be a part of their community at, wonderful community. And I saw they had signs out front that said, "He is risen." And I thought, yes, he is. That's also like skipping to the end. It's Palm Sunday. The week has just barely begun. We like to skip to the end. Also, kudos to them. They planned ahead. Now, if you're ever reading the story of Jesus in Mark's gospel, which was the very first one written after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, if you ever decided to skip to the end, you'd probably be pretty shocked. Because Mark's gospel ends so abruptly that actually throughout the years, people have tried to fix it or to finish it because it's felt a little unfinished. In fact, depending on what your translation is, you could find up to 3 separate endings, all factually correct, just not written by Mark, that were added on by the 2nd century and by the 4th century. Because, well, it has a kind of strange ending. So sometimes if you're reading the Bible, it'll actually make a note of it, like this wasn't in the earliest versions of this. So today we're going to read from Mark's gospel, his unfinished ending, and we're going to end where he ended. And so if you have worship notes in front of you, that's great. I will read the text if you just want to close your eyes and enter it with me. We're in Mark 16, verses 1 through 8. This is the word of the Lord. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. That's Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robes sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. He said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, here is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So wait a minute, you might be thinking, that's the end? That's the end of Mark's account? That can't be the end. Wait, let's check. Now, the angel comes, tells the women at the break of dawn, Jesus has risen, right, to not be afraid, to bring the good news, and then they run away in fear and don't tell anyone. Yeah, that's verse 8. That's it. That's where the original manuscripts end. You might notice this story feels kind of unfinished. Mark didn't quite end at the end. The sun has barely risen. The whole day is still ahead. And we know from history and from other eyewitness accounts that a lot more happens in the rest of the day. For some reason, Mark doesn't want to skip to the end of the story. And it makes me wonder why. And I'm not the only one. Bible scholars through the centuries have wondered this. Mark, why did you leave the story so abruptly? Was your hand tired of writing? Did you run out of papyrus paper? No, there's another reason. We're going to get back to that. Now, although Mark left his ending purposefully unfinished, that's not the only unique thing about Mark's account of the resurrection. There's something else very unique about his telling, something only he mentions about the resurrection out of all the other Gospels. We're going to go look in verse 3 for that. But just for some background info, I want you to picture the scene with me. Right? The sun comes up as the women are on their way to their tomb. That means they begin in the dark. Mary Magdalene, she had been healed and delivered from so much in her life by Jesus. There's Mary, the mother of James, who might have been Jesus' mother, perhaps another Mary. And Salome, these women, followers, disciples, friends of Jesus. They're on their way to this place of death, this place of pain, while it's still dark. And they're bringing with them all these spices and these ointments that would have been customary for someone of Jesus' influence and belovedness to be buried with. And in the fresh morning light, they were planning to do the painful work of uncovering Jesus' wounds, his bruises, his injuries, and covering them with oil, with spices. It would have taken so much love and courage to do this. You can imagine like maybe the mother of Emmett Till or other relatives of horrific victims of crimes who insisted on open caskets for their children so people could see what had been done to them. These women, what they were going to do to Jesus' body required so much courage. It was a form of protest and love, what they were about to do. And while they're walking to the tomb very early in the morning, one thing was on their mind in verse 3. It wasn't, what if the military police who are guarding the tomb arrest us? They weren't wondering that. They could have. They weren't thinking, how will we explain ourselves to those who might ask why we're here? They weren't wondering that. Mark's story is the only one to include the question on their minds. Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb? Who will roll away the stone? And this was a great question because Jesus was buried in a wealthy man's tomb. And it was customary in those days for the tomb to be sort of like carved into the rock with this ginormous stone that would cover the entrance. Some of them, it was inserted sort of like a peg. In other ones, it was this round one that would roll. And I think Karen might even have a picture of King Herod's tomb, similar one from the day where you have this 2-ton stone that would roll in front, sort of the entrance of this cave that would protect the body inside. And so it was a very, very heavy stone. And Jesus was buried in a very beautiful, wealthy man's tomb, because even though Jesus was poor, after his death, he was given the gift of this tomb. So you can imagine this huge stone that was going to be covering the entrance of the tomb, and these 3 little women carrying a lot of spices and ointments with them. They're tired. It's like barely daybreak. Who's going to roll away the stone? Mark might not have wanted a complete ending to his book, but he did want us to ask this question with the women. Who will do the heavy lifting for us? Who will do the heavy lifting for us? And most of us, if we're honest, we will hear this question as a deeply human question because God knows we have some heavy things in our lives. Rose shared in her video a very heavy story of sudden loss, of death, the pain of separation, of her inner wilderness, asking God, why and how will I be moving forward? God knows you have some heavy things in your life too, whether it's difficulties with parenting, whether it's the exhaustion of being a caregiver or a student, whether it's the ongoing weight of an addiction or substance abuse or a physical or mental illness. Life is hard and it's heavy. And God knows we carry weighty things, the weight of grief, of loss, of separation, the weight of COVID. God knows that for many of us, we go through our lives thinking, who will do the heavy lifting for us? And oftentimes we kind of try to do it ourselves. And sometimes, we might do okay. But then there are those situations that we're just in over our heads in. We cannot carry it anymore. Jacob Kurtzberg, best known by the name that he wrote under, Jack Kirby, was a prolific and extremely influential American comic book artist and writer and editor. He's one of the greats. If you've heard of Captain America or Thor or Black Panther, Jacob Kurtzberg is the one who came up with those characters. Iron Man, and there's more. I'm forgetting my superheroes. Those are just a few of the characters he invented and wrote about. And I came across this interview he did in the 90s where he describes inspiration for another one of his characters. And this is what he said. This little child was playing in the gutter. Okay, guys, this is like the 50s. I guess kids played in the gutter then. I don't know. This little child was playing in the gutter and he was crawling from the gutter onto the sidewalk. There was a car parked by the sidewalk. Then the child stuck his head out from under the running board of the car, which was parked. He was having difficulty crawling out from under the running board back onto the sidewalk. His mother looked like she was about to scream. She looked very desperate. She didn't scream, but instead she ran over to the car and, very determined, she lifted up the entire back end of the car to free her child so he could climb up onto the sidewalk. I have a lot of questions about that story. Why was the kite in the gutter? Well, what kind of car is this? This is a scary story. But as this comic book writer witnessed this scene near this park, I'm guessing, who knows, he was inspired to write the Hulk. Someone who, when they needed to, could do some heavy lifting. And I think we are drawn to these characters, these people, these stories of heavy lifting. Someone who can do it when called for. And the women, they're wondering this when they get to verse 3, when they get to Jesus' tomb. And verse 4, when they realize someone has already done the heavy lifting for them. Can you imagine their amazement? They're wondering how it happened. Someone did the heavy lifting for them. And the good news of Easter, my friends, is that God has done the heavy lifting for you, for me, for the whole world. In Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, incarnate God becoming human, taking on God's self, all the sin of the world, offering God's own self for the sake of the world whom God loves. There's this beautiful quote by this wonderful theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, in his powerful book, The Crucified God. You might need to close your eyes to hear it. I don't know. It's a very heavy quote, but this is what he says about the crucifixion and resurrection. It can be summed up by saying that suffering is overcome by suffering, and wounds are healed by wounds. For the suffering in suffering is the lack of love, and the wounds in wounds are the abandonment, and the powerlessness in pain is unbelief. And therefore, the suffering of abandonment is overcome by the suffering of love, which is not afraid of what is sick and ugly, but accepts it and takes it to itself in order to heal it through. This is the heavy lifting of God, my friends. Jesus' love, in solidarity with humanity, takes the cost of sin and brokenness, abandonment, all upon God's own self, paying the wages of sin, as the Apostle Paul put it, breaking the powers of sin, death, and the grave over humanity. And every year, Christians, we move through Holy Week, right? We begin on Palm Sunday and we observe Good Friday. We wait in the shadows on Holy Saturday. And we remember that the crucified God does not detach God's self from the worst of humanity. The crucified God enters into the ugly place of sin, violence, and God-forsakenness, doing the heavy lifting for us so our wounds can be healed. Because only a God who has bled can comfort those who bleed. Only a God who has suffered injustice can rightly administer justice. Only a God who has suffered can enter the place of suffering, death, and pain and transfigure it with a love that challenges and changes us and invites us, as we put our hope in Jesus, to become God's own instruments of healing in our relationships, in our workplaces, in our families, in our local communities, and in our whole world. Today, we're sitting in the strangeness of Mark's unfinished ending and the beautiful detail of it too. I want you to ask yourself, where do you need God to do the heavy lifting for you? Are you stumbling under the weight of something that is just too heavy to roll away? The good news of Easter is that Jesus has won the victory for you. The stone has already been rolled away. You might go around your lives thinking, who will roll it away? It is finished. It is done. You and I can have hope that our struggles can be overcome because God in us has overcome the world. We can have hope that God's strength and power can free us wherever we are stuck, can transform our inner wilderness as we do life with God and listen with God and give God consent to work in our lives. We have hope that wherever there's obstacles between us and God or us and others, that God can do the heavy lifting and has done the heavy lifting so that even in our place of pain, death, addiction, depression, there can be rays of light peeking in, holy ground where you least expect. Going back to Mark's strange ending, it's an unfinished ending because Mark is inviting you and me to step into the ending and continue the story. Continue the story. Keep it going. Right, the women, they run out of the tomb. They're scared. They're amazed. They don't tell anyone. But you know what? The day is still in front of them. We know from their own story that they go back to the tomb. Mary goes back to the tomb, witnesses the resurrected Christ. They go tell the disciples. The disciples tell the world. They see Jesus. You and I are here today because someone lived into the unfinished story of Easter. And friends, the day was still ahead for the women when Mark decided to cut his story short. The day is still ahead for us, too. The sun has barely gone up. We don't know how long we have to live, but you know what? We have this moment right here. We have this day. What will you do with it? How will you live into your Easter story? The world has never been the same because a few women discovered that someone had done the heavy lifting for them, Jesus, because they lived into the ongoing story of Easter. So friends, the day lies ahead of you. The heavy lifting is behind you. Continue the Easter story. So I'm going to say this, and you can repeat after me as we close our time together and as Pastor Cheryl comes up to do our communion. I'm going to say the phrase, and you can repeat it after me. So we're just going to do a test. The day lies ahead of me. Oh, it's great. You don't need a test. Okay, let's try it anyway again. Okay, here we go. The day lies ahead of me. The heavy lifting is behind me. I will continue the Easter story. Amen. So be it.